Richer nations have pledged $100 billion a year to help developing countries cut carbon emissions. But new data shows that it's not being met. The charity Oxfam says the shortfall means climate-vulnerable countries could miss out on up to $75 billion in total over the 6-year target period. Joining me now is Jan Kowalzig, the charity's Senior Policy Advisor on Climate Change. Thanks for coming on the programme. Look, these are big numbers that we're talking about. Big misses. What's going on?
The problem here is the lack of political will from the side of developed countries. They have made, 12 years ago, the promise to provide $100 billion a year from 2020 onwards through to 2025 to support poorer nations, the vulnerable nations who urgently need the support to confront the climate crisis. And support did happen and has increased over time, but we are about 20 billion short at the moment, and we are not likely to see the 100 billion goal to be met. Neither was it met in 2020 as originally promised, nor will it be met by our estimate in 2025. And this leads to this huge shortfall. So the problem is the lack of developed countries' commitments to actually scale up funding to support countries, and possibly also technical problems they had in mobilizing private investments that they were hoping would fill the gap they would leave from the public funds they provide.
So which countries then become at highest risk as a result of this shortfall?
The support doesn't materialize as promised. This means, of course, that it's the most vulnerable countries in the world that are already suffering most from the worsening impacts of the climate crisis, such as droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events linked to climate change. And already now, only a quarter of support actually is targeted to enhance adaptation or resilience in those countries to protect people and their livelihoods from the worsening climate impacts. So when developed countries do not meet their commitments to provide this urgently needed support, this means action in those countries to make people more resilient, allow the survival of small island nations and so forth, will not materialize. And that means actions cannot be funded, which leaves these countries out in the open to suffer the impacts of the climate crisis.
Ever ambitious climate plans for developing countries hinge on international funding and support, as you say. But since Oxfam's projections say that wealthy nations are going to continue to fall short on their pledges, is there an argument to lower the targets in the first place so that they can be met?
No, of course not, because these targets were set in 2009, and we already know they are outdated when it comes to the needs of the developing countries in confronting the climate crisis. So the needs are much higher than this 100 billion target. So lowering this target even further may mean, yes, maybe they meet the target that they have just lowered, but of course this doesn't translate into more action in developing countries that we need so urgently. So what we need is that developed countries step up their act, increase their ambition, redouble their pledges, and make sure that they present a roadmap to meeting the goal no later than this year's UN annual climate gathering that will happen in Glasgow later this year. So that's the moment when we will need to see the truth if this target is ever going to be met.
The United States, Canada and Germany, they've all increased their pledges and commitments. More commitments were made at G7 to narrow the funding gap. So what more would you like to see? And does that include changes to how the climate finance is then allocated?
There's two things that are important here. A, we need to meet this target, and that would require some of the countries to announce pledges how to increase. For instance, Italy is one of the G7 members, and they haven't said anything how they are going to increase climate finance support. But also the support, say, that the United States have pledged to provide is largely seen as inadequate. And so we are also expecting the US to step up their act and provide more funding. And then on the use of the support, yes, you point to the right direction. We need more support going into adaptation, into assisting vulnerable nations to make their societies more resilient against droughts and floods and so forth. At the moment, it's only a quarter of overall support that goes into this sector, but we need to get at least to half of that, half of the overall support, which is, by the way, also asked that UN Secretary General Guterres has asked world leaders to provide.
Jan Kowalzig, inadequate indeed. Thank you very much.